We begin as if the sea itself has invited us to lower our voices. The hush of deep water folds around our shoulders, and sunlight above thins to a patient, distant shimmer. Weightless, we feel the cool pressure of the world and a steady current like a sleeping heart. Our movements lengthen and our thoughts follow them. It is a curious, quiet promise. Tonight we will visit places that remember by keeping pottery, thresholds, an old step, small reliquaries held in salt. Breathe with me now. Let your chest rise and fall with the mild rhythm of the tide, and let your shoulders loosen. We are not here to solve, only to notice, not to catalog, only to stay. Long, folding sentences will carry us. Small images will settle between words like shells and sand. Listen for the faint scrape of sand against old stone, for the imagined hush of a courtyard where laughter has softened into tide, and for the small, bright clink of a coin that remembers the weight of a hand. We step, together, into the larger day of that lost world, not with the brisk footsteps of an examiner, but with the slow, attentive step of someone visiting an old friend. Imagine a morning that begins not with alarm, but with the measured tasks of tending. A dock where ropes are checked, an oven coaxed back to life, a child settling a wooden bowl, and a woman who knows the exact hour the tide will turn. There is sound here. There is the held breath between sounds, and we let both be equal measures in our listening. We will move through 4 small set pieces this evening. The harbor that remembers commerce like a melody, an oak avenue that keeps the footfalls of generations in its roots, a low hearth where loaves rise in time, and a tidal plain that kept its farmers and its secrets in a slow rhythm of salt and mud. First, the harbor. Picture a crescent of stone and timber where merchants meet the tongue of the sea. From the west, a barge slides slowly to its moor, the oars speaking a soft, wooden conversation with the water. There is the metallic rasp of a fishmonger's knife, the dull thud of crates, the high, familiar cackling of gulls folded into the sky like paper birds. We hear a distant barter, a long syllable of negotiation that ends in a laugh, and the sound of that laugh settles into the salt like a small bell. Listen for the tactile details, the rope that smells faintly of tar and citrus, the grain of an old plank worn smooth by generations of saws, the powdery salt on a child's sleeve where he has been testing the brightness of a coin. There is a steady measure to this place. We buy, we barter, we walk the jetty. The repetition itself is a kind of lullaby. In the harbor we see economy not as abstraction but as a rhythm, the exchanging of small objects that keep communities bound. Now turn inland a little, along an avenue where ancient oaks form a green vaulted roof above a lane of compacted earth. The trees remember footfalls, soft sandals, cartwheels, the long, slow passage of a funeral procession. Imagine the cool understory, the smell of crushed leaves and resin, the whisper of cloth as a woman passes with a bundle. We can place our hands to the bark, if one likes to imagine such things, and feel the slow warmth that the sun stores in summer and releases in small, measured breaths. There is a scholar's aside here. One might suppose that a lane is merely a lane, but lanes are archives, each pressed footprint a line of text. We read them not with eyes but with bodies, and the oak avenue holds that bodily memory like a slow manuscript. In this shade, children chase a stray dog. A man pauses to tie a strip of cloth. An old woman hums a tune that is half a prayer and half a recipe. And then the hearth, which is intimately domestic and therefore, perhaps, the most precious of all. A low house with a broad, rounded hearth where bread is coaxed from flour and patience. We sit, as if on the very edge of the embers, and listen to a woman folding dough like a map, her hands making the same motions that her mother made. The sound is soft, the dull, steady slap of dough on a board, the whisper of a child's lullaby half remembered, the faint clink of a spoon. There is the smell of wood smoke and soaked clay tiles. There is the peculiar, domestic geometry of a room that has known mornings and storms and small reconciliations. Close to the hearth, a pot simmers with legumes and sea herbs whose scent is almost marine, as though the sea itself has entered the household to bless the meal. We notice a scrap of embroidery, a stitch pulled in a precise pattern. The household keeps its stories in small textile folds. Finally, the tidal plain, a wide, patient expanse where the land and sea converse in a slow, halting language. Here there are reed beds and shallow channels that mark the moods of the months. There are fields where salt-tolerant grasses bend like prayer flags. Imagine a farmer guiding a small herd across a muddy track, his boots leaving a text of wet impressions. Imagine a woman bending to collect shell and root to flavor a stew. The plain has a different tempo than the harbor. Its measure is geological and domestic at once, and its sounds are of water finding its own level. The soft plop of a crab, the distant, hollow call of a curlew, the steady sigh of water retreating from a dike. Here, more than anywhere, time feels patient. Processes that seem quick to a day's eye are slow as a tide to a lover's patience. We feel the cool clay under our toes as we stand with them, and that bodily sense anchors us to a rhythm that is older than the market or the house. Do you not feel, as we move through these set pieces, a kind of sustained wonder, an ache that is not sharp but that pulls at the ribs like a low bell? We ask questions not to answer them so much as to keep attention gentle. How many hands smoothed that plank in the harbor? How many lullabies braided into that hearth smoke? What conversations did the oaks overhear and keep? A scholar's aside, to call these images reconstructed is both true and misleading. Reconstruction suggests a puzzle solved, whereas what we do is more like listening to an echo and letting it take shape in the mind. We do not insist on certainty, we offer a hospitable imagining. There is, throughout all these places, a shared musicality. The creak of timber answering the sigh of the sea, the soft percussion of cartwheels on compacted earth, the whisper of cloth. These are not grand sounds. They are domestic, tactile, and therefore deeply soothing when allowed their full time. Notice the small repeated gestures, the rolling of dough, the knotting of a rope, the bending to lift a child, the checking of a net. Each is a tiny metronome. As we attend to them, our own breathing falls into that same metronome. The mind, which likes novelty, receives instead a rhythm and, in doing so, loosens its grip. Let us return, briefly, to the body. Feel the weight of the water around you as a supportive hand, the slight chill at the nape of your neck, the softening of the jaw. Place attention on your feet. We imagine the compacted lane beneath them, or the cool, giving mud of the tidal plain, and allow that tactile imagination to ease the muscles of the lower legs. When we imagine the rhythm of the harbor, the loading, the dropping, the sliding, let the pattern map gently to your heartbeat for a moment. Then let the heartbeat return to its own, unhurried pace. A small anchor of fact, offered as a soft lamp rather than a bright torch. These coasts were lived-in places, changed slowly by people who planted, prayed, traded, and mended. There is the laugh of a merchant, the scent of incense hovering at a temple door, the recorded note in an old ledger that lists barley and salt in the same line. Such details are the grain of history. But our interest here is not in exhaustive precision. It is in the texture. We honor the people by letting their ordinary acts become, for a time, the center of our attention. So these 4 micro-scenes, harbor, Oak Avenue, hearth, tidal plain, are not discrete curiosities but verses in a single, long song about domestic endurance. They show us how communities were woven together by small acts and predictable rhythms, and how those rhythms make a place legible to memory. We can imagine a day in that world as a sequence of returns. Return to the dock, return to the lane, return to the hearth, return to the field. Each return confirming a continuity that comforts. There is no hurry here. Even the busiest market is conducted at a human pace, and each hand movement is given weight and meaning. There is more to this day than the outline I have given. Of course, there are smaller rituals nested inside larger ones. The soft polishing of a merchant's scales with oil, the way a child will test the warmth of a loaf with the tip of a finger, the precise manner in which a net is folded to keep its knots untangled. Consider the crafts that support these lives. A potter who reads the weather in the dampness of clay, a smith who listens to the tempered ring of a blade to judge its temper, weavers who count threads like prayers. Each craft offers its own soundscape. If you close your eyes now, you might imagine the soft tap of a hammer against a metal curve, the whisper of a loom, the gentle, rhythmical brushing of a broom across a packed yard. We might ask, with no urgency to answer, how did these smallnesses accumulate into a life that felt complete to the people who lived it? What small satisfactions were the keepers of a day's meaning? The scholar in me wants to name categories, but the companion beside you says, let us keep close to the senses, for the senses are what make a human life palpable. There is also the temporal texture of such a day. Morning is measured differently here. It is less the abrupt waking to an alarm and more the layered ascending of tasks. Coals coaxed, nets shaken, children gathered, ledgers unrolled. Toward midday, the sun writes thin heat scripts across the harbor stones. The Oak Avenue pools shadow that cools the soles of passing feet. The hearth keeps a patient glow, and the tidal plain breathes in salt air and sighs out mud. In the late afternoon, there are returnings. Boats inch into their berths. Baskets are carried back from fields. The light becomes softer, and the city's sounds fold inward like a hand closing. I will not fill you with names or dates. Those belong to other kinds of telling. Instead, notice how the ordinary cares of the day shape a moral geography. Places where debts are paid, places where grievances are aired and settled, places where children are entrusted to neighbors. This social architecture is as important as any wall. It is what made the town durable until the larger forces, weather, sea, shifting soil, remade that durability into something else. And if we let ourselves be tender toward what was lost, we remember that loss is often gentle in its onset. It arrives as small compromises that accrue like silt until the picture itself is reconfigured. If one listens closely in this imagined day, one begins to perceive the sea not only as an agent of ruin, but also as a slow archivist that preserves certain intimacies. The coin in the child's palm, the stitch in the cloth, the groove on a plank. These small things survive in particular ways, and they invite us to remember with gentleness rather than with sharpness. We carry this gentle attention forward into the next part of our descent, holding the rhythm of these lives like a soft rope that guides our hands. We slow then, and allow the day's thin music to be interrupted by something quieter still, the small, patient absence that gathers like a shadow across a room. The primary mystery we carry with us is not a headline, but a hush, a street that seems to lie beneath the water like a sleeping spine, its carts and thresholds visible only when the light falls at a certain angle. Imagine coming upon such a sight unexpectedly. The straight line of a paving, the half-moon of a doorway, the suggestion of a stair that ends in silt. You recognize, at once, the human scale of what you see and are startled by the fact that the scale is preserved while the function is not. What does one do with that first, hush-shaped recognition? There are several polite scholarly responses and several more imaginative ones. We will try a few, all in a gentle spirit. One response is the patient, geological account. The land itself can sink in slow, unforgiving breaths. A coast, once firm enough for houses and fields, might gradually compact under the weight of years, or it might be undermined by a subtle change in a river channel, a slow undermining that feels, to the people living there, like an increasingly damp doorway or a patch of field that yields to salt. We will name these gently, like herbs laid on a small wound. Slow subsidence, sudden breach, human slow undoing. None of them excludes the others. Often, as scholars quietly note, disasters are syndromes rather than tidy causes. One might suppose, as a cautious mind would, that the truth is a weave of several strands, a little leaning of the earth here, an unusually high season there, a practice of drainage that seemed sensible until it was not. And the wonder is that each of these strands leaves different kinds of traces: a torn tile, a corridor half-silted, a ledger that simply stops recording a family's name. But let us not make the account too technical. The human element is where the mystery becomes intimate. Imagine, not the abstract phrase decline, but the small, private losses that add up. A boat that no longer answers when summoned. A child's path to a schoolhouse that becomes a slick trace in the mud. A surname that vanishes from the ledgers as people move in search of steadier ground. Picture a woman pausing at a doorway to feel the new dampness underfoot and, with a practical finality, deciding to move a chest to the upper room. Imagine an elder looking at a map and drawing a new line where a ditch used to be. That is how slow disappearance sometimes reads, in decisions that are not dramatic but are cumulative. The ziggurat enters our narrative here not like a headline, but as a slow, solemn shape rising beneath the water, a place where the town's purpose and its ritual life once focused. Picture a stepped structure of stone, softened at the corners, its terraces colonized now by waving algae and the occasional anemone. See, too, the dark tongues of shadow between its steps where fish have made crevices their own. We do not, at first, think of a ziggurat as domestic, and yet it was threaded through daily life. Offerings left on a parapet at dawn, a child's footfall skipping the shallow step, a priest counting the hours by the sun's angle. Imagine, if you will, that we find an entrance on one of those terraces, a small doorway carved into the stone and almost hidden by a curtain of lace-like weed. We lean closer, and in that inner passage the water becomes quieter, as if the architecture itself holds a breath. Here, in a place designed to bridge sky and earth, we pause at an inner chamber where the silence is thicker and the sediment has settled like folded paper. If we could place our hands there, we would feel the stone's coolness and the faint grit of silt that has come to rest as a secondary skin on top of carved reliefs. It is in such an inner chamber that we find the small, symbolic object that will become the spine of our emotional account. A child's carved peg, perhaps, or a painted bead, or a wooden toy worn down by play until its contours are soft and familiar. Note how smallness works in these moments. The monumental and the intimate fold into one another. The ziggurat, built for public rites and the marking of time, has kept a private token for us to stumble upon. A peg that fits a child's hand, its edges smoothed by thumb and abrasion, its surface faintly stained with some pigment that time has not fully erased. The peg speaks of play, routine, and the kindness with which lives are lived. When scholars speak of inner chambers, they often use cautious terms: cultic space, storage recess, ritual niche, and they argue in journals and at conferences about deposits and stratigraphy. But for our purposes tonight, the chamber invites a simpler, kinder response. We bend, we imagine, and in the act of imagining we form a bridge to the people who once held that peg. The child's thumb against the wooden curve becomes, for a moment, our bridge to a life that was, in many practical ways, indistinguishable from our own, full of small domesticities, private jokes, and repeated kindnesses. Now, as we consider the possible pathways to disappearance, let us alternate intimate moments of loss with the broad outlines of conjecture. Picture a house on the edge of the plain where a family kept a net drying across two poles. One winter the net grows damp, and its fibers rot faster than usual, and a child's toy is left on a windowsill and forgotten as the family debates whether to stay or to go. In another scene, a merchant writes with a steady hand in his ledger, listing barley and salt, and then pauses because a particularly high tide has flooded the quay. He makes the pragmatic choice to move his scales higher the next day, then the next, until one morning the ledger's hand looks hesitant and then stops. Each theory of disappearance, slow subsidence, sudden breach, or human-driven change also carries social consequences. Slow subsidence can be a series of small relocations and rearrangements. Neighbors helping neighbors, furniture raised on blocks, thresholds negotiated by polite consensus. In that narrative, there is resilience woven into the fabric of daily living. The sudden breach narrative is more abrupt. People flee with what they can carry, and the social architecture disperses. Memory is carried in artifacts and stories, often scattering families across wider geographies. Human-driven change, such as the exhaustion of upland resources, the alteration of irrigation, the wear of trade routes, is more ambiguous because it implies responsibility or adaptation, and we must then ask whom we blame and whom we credit for survival. The ambiguity hook here is simple. Absence is not a single thing. Absence accrues textures. The softness of silt, the sharpness of a broken tile, the particular smell of peat when it dries on a summer day. And those textures tug at our imagination in different ways. We might see absence and immediately supply a cause that comforts our desire for narrative neatness. But the truth is often more layered, and it asks us to practice less certainty and more attentive listening. There is also a temporal ambiguity to these processes. What seemed sudden to one generation might be the late stage of a slow change that was already perceptible to those who lived through it. Conversely, a long decay might be punctuated by a sudden event that reorients the scale of loss. We might imagine a town where, for decades, people patched dikes, raised embankments, coaxed crops from salter soil, and only after many small successes did an exceptional storm finally complete the reconfiguration. Conversely, a single collapse in a well-trimmed harbor wall might have precipitated an exodus that later generations remembered as a catastrophe. We return now to our inner chamber peg. Hold that object in your mind as a fulcrum. The peg is not evidence of a cataclysm. It is a proof of continuity. It tells us that for however the community changed, there were always children whose hands shaped objects and whose play made patterns. The peg invites us to feel, in a bodily way, the dimension of loss. We picture our own thumb in that curve and sense a small, private grief that is personal and easily consoled by imagination. That grief, held gently, is a proper companion to curiosity. We also imagine, with careful speculation, how the environment has preserved some things and erased others. Organic objects such as wood and textiles usually decay faster than ceramics. But in anoxic, silted conditions, the rate of decay can slow considerably. The absence of oxygen is a kind of slow freeze that keeps certain materials in a state of suspended presence. Thus, a peg, if it falls into clean silt and the conditions are favorable, might endure far longer than one would expect on dry land. A scholar's aside here is that preservation is capricious. Mud can be a generous custodian, stone an indifferent one. Now let us imagine the moment of communal decision. A council in a high house where elders weigh the options. A young family packing a small chest of valuables. A merchant wrapping his scales in cloth and thinking of the routes he might take by sea. None of these images is dramatic in the cinematic sense. They are small, precise motions, and they map onto real, lived griefs and consolations. The choices are practical, and they are moral. Who will be entrusted with a child? Which neighbor receives a crucial tool? Which field will be left to fallow? Those micro-choices define the texture of disappearance. We must also allow for quieter, unseen continuities. People who remained and adapted, who learned to live with salter fields and fashion new rhythms out of old habits. We imagine a farmer coaxing new crops from the edge of the plain, learning the small craft of selecting salt-tolerant seedlings. We imagine mothers improvising recipes that make use of new flavors. We imagine potters altering their mixes. These acts reconfigure identity rather than simply erase it. Culture bends and sometimes becomes unexpectedly, resiliently local. The mystery, then, is less about an ending than about a transformation that bears residues in both objects and stories. A further dimension of conjecture attends to the interplay of human choices and natural forces. Did certain agricultural practices accelerate salt ingress? Did the rerouting of a small tributary to ease irrigation quietly change the sediment load at the coast? This is where historical ecology meets the intimate life of a street. Technical decisions and household rhythms blend into one another, and the record they leave is both material and behavioral. It is a curious and comforting fact that the same hands who mended a net could, with care, learn to mend a field. We should not, however, rush to moral judgment. People acted with what knowledge they had and with what love they could muster. The social bonds that prompt neighbors to share grain are the same ones that motivate them to attempt dike repair year after year. There will be heroic preserves of care in the record, as well as moments of practical surrender. The scholar in us catalogs, the companion in us grieves and admires in the same breath. As we draw this section toward a close, let us place our attention briefly back in our bodies. Feel the stillness behind the breastbone, the soft widening of the ribs as breath comes in, the gentle lengthening as it goes out. Consider our hands in the act of holding the peg, not touching a cold and distant artifact, but touching a human shape across time. Let that small tactile imagination ground the rest of our descent. And finally, a last ambiguity hook to carry us forward. Might the silent street we saw be, in different lights, both an invitation and a warning? It invites us to tenderness. It warns, softly, that the familiar will one day be rearranged. We accept both lessons and, with our imaginations eased, we move on deeper into the ruins' quiet to meet the next part of our descent. We move now from imagination into the small, insistently modern moments of rediscovery, those sequences of ordinary sensation that open onto very old things. It often begins in the least ceremonious way. A fishing net snagged on something that should not be there. The sharp, surprised tug against the hull that turns a fisherman's day into a question. Picture the net's fibers at first slipping over a curved edge, then catching, a muffled, heavy resistance that feels as if the sea has handed up a secret and will not let it go without protest. From that humble opening, an image often travels quickly in our contemporary networks. A blurred thumbnail from a phone, then a more careful photograph taken by someone who has learned how to read the peculiar language of light beneath shallow water. The camera's shutter makes a small, civilized bell against the larger oceanic hush. Its click feels almost impertinent in the presence of such slow things, and yet it is a civilizing courtesy. We document what we can so that memory can be shared and taken seriously. Imagine a photograph shown on a dock, passed thumb to thumb, and the way a slight intake of breath can travel through a small group like a shared secret. It is common, in the modern pattern, for discovery to proceed in stages. The snag, the photograph, a conversation, a call to an authority, and then a more clinical verification. A sonar blip often arrives as a later, sterner voice. A machine sends a ping into the deep and listens for echoes. The return is a dot or a line on a screen that looks, at first, like an abstract pattern. Yet there is an odd lyricism to these pings. Each one is a tiny, mechanical question, and the sea answers in its measured, metallic tone. The sight of a plotted line on a monitor can set a committee to gather or a diver to prepare. Then come the divers, who translate between the language of tools and the grammar of the sea. Picture a diver easing through a column of water, the hiss of breath through a regulator marking out a steady, almost lullaby-like cadence. In, out, in, out. The regulator's breath is a mechanical metronome that, strangely, calms the nerves. It overlays the natural sounds and becomes, for the moment, the human tempo in this watery world. Beneath the diver's gloved fingers, stone feels unlike the dry rock we imagine. It has a lubricious, ancient smoothness and a skin of sediment that slips in the touch and reforms when released. When a gloved hand finds a carved edge or a rounded toy peg, the sensation is both immediate and mediated. We feel the artifact through the glove through the suit, and the suit through the breath that keeps the diver alive. We will dwell for a while on this tactile astonishment because it matters. Touch is the hinge by which the modern and the ancient meet. Imagine the diver reaching into a crevice and lifting a small, silt-muffled object, perhaps another toy peg, perhaps a small bead or a corner of textile too delicate to see fully underwater, and bringing it forward so that a camera on their chest can register a silhouette. The object's surface is dimly alive with a whisper of algae. When water is brushed away, pigment may glimmer like a memory. The chore of lifting, bagging, and labeling is itself a choreography of respect. A plastic bag sealed, a small tag attached, a careful hand passing an object upward through a hatch into air and light. Back on shore, the lab waits with its cool fluorescence and the soft mechanical chorus of instruments. The arrival of an object at a lab table is a movement from the theatrical to the intimate. The object is rinsed in measured water, gently dried, and placed upon sterile cloth. Catalogs are opened, accession numbers assigned, and the hum of centrifuges and refrigerators forms a domestic backdrop to the work. Picture the tiny, concentrated soundscape of a lab. The click of a mouse, the measured whir of a machine, the soft rustle of latex gloves, the faint scrape of a scalpel. These are modest noises that aggregate into care. A conservator's hand holds a shard up to a lamp, and the lamplight reveals a hairline of paint or a whisper of thread that the water had kept hidden. There is often, tucked into the public sequence of rediscovery, a private astonishment that is not for newspapers and not for press releases. A conservator alone in a quiet room with a bead cupped to a lamp, or a diver who sits for a long while with a clean shard in their palms. That private moment is not about ownership, but about recognition. The reaction is small and human, a tightening of breath and a suppressed smile, as if the past has offered a private joke. Imagine the conservator's soft intake of air, the nearly inaudible murmur of thanks, the way an old craftsman's line might edge out in a whispered identification. These are the human sounds that rarely make the evening news, but that matter to those who tend memory. Once objects and images have been authenticated, there are public forms of recognition. Community meetings, small exhibitions, guided walks where fragments are laid under glass, or where projections show the lines that divers traced across a submerged wall. Picture a seaside hall with folding chairs, the warm glow of a projector, and a crowd gathered of fishermen, grandchildren, and a few curious visitors. A diver speaks plainly about what it felt like to lay a gloved hand on a terrace of the ziggurat. "It was colder than I expected," she says, and the sentence carries both surprise and tenderness. The talk is punctuated by quiet laughter, by the soft rustle of programs, and by the careful, considered questions of someone who remembers the place from childhood. Through all these stages, sound remains a central interpreter. Here, in your mind, the net's first startled jerk, the papery click of a camera, the clean ping of the sonar, the bubbled rhythm of a regulator, the lab's little mechanical chorus, and the murmur of an assembled crowd. Each sound has its tactile correlate. The rope's roughness under a fisherman's thumb, the camera's cool metal against a palm, the regulator's weight pressing into a suit, the lab bench's sterile chill, the warm collective breath of an audience leaning forward. These pairings of sound and touch are the immediate, human way we make meaning of recovery. There is also the prosaic choreography of institutions. Permits are written, small committees meet, grants are proposed, and ethical reviews take place. I mention this not to dampen romance, but to stress that rediscovery occurs inside networks of care and accountability. The paperwork, the cautious reports, and the funding proposals are forms of constraint that can be tedious and bureaucratic. Yes, but they are also ways of promising stewardship. Someone signs a form because they believe that a child's toy, once returned, should be preserved for a future hand to hold. Let us return to a tender, solitary image. A diver surfaces with a small object sealed in a bag, a carved peg matching in miniature the peg we found in the ziggurat's inner chamber, and hands it across a deck to a conservator who smiles in a private, almost conspiratorial way. The conservator traces the peg's worn curve with a gloved fingertip and murmurs a soft exclamation, then places it into padding and a box, as if putting a small pulse to sleep. Later, alone, she will hold it to a lamp and see the ancient pigment flame for a moment, and she will feel what artisans feel, a companionship in craft that stretches across centuries. Not every promising sign proves to be an ancient monument. Misrecognitions are common. A sonar anomaly might be a shell-strewn dune, a photograph a trick of reflected light, and a net snag could be tangled modern debris. Modern investigators learn humility early because nature misleads as often as it reveals. False positives, then, are not failures but part of a patient discipline. The true work unfolds in quiet lab hours, in careful notes, in peer discussion. The slow, methodical labor of checking context and stratigraphy is itself a kind of devotion. There is often a choreography, too, between local memory and technical method. Elders remember a quay where their grandparents once moored a skiff. Fishermen trace a childhood memory on a current map. Satellite imagery sometimes reveals faint parallel lines that are echoed in village lore. When local knowledge and technical data are brought together, the outcome is a richer, more humane understanding. Community voices direct divers to the spots worth a second look, and scientific instruments help to interpret the shapes that oral memory preserves. Discovery, in that sense, becomes collaborative rather than extractive. Decisions about conservation demand ethical care. Should fragile objects be left in situ where sediment and water keep them stable, or should they be retrieved into controlled climates where they can be studied and displayed? Should an exposed wall be covered to preserve it, or revealed for teaching? Divers plan their routes to avoid scuffing mosaics. Conservators debate whether removal will do more harm than preservation. These are not merely technical choices. They are moral conversations about how best to respect the dead while serving the living. Imagine, for a quiet coda in this part of our descent, a public evening where photographs are projected in a small hall and a diver describes the feeling of touching the ziggurat's terrace. Her words are tactile and unadorned. It surprised me how soft the stone was, as if time had thinned it. There were grooves like fingerprints where so many small hands had rested. The room listens, an elder nods and adds a family story about offerings carried to that very terrace. A child asks if toys like the peg were common. Someone laughs softly, and a tissue is passed across a row. The scene is ordinary and profoundly humane. As we hold these sequences together, net snag, first photograph, sonar blip, diver's gloved reach, the lab table's close light, and the public walk, we can perceive a rhythm. The accidental encounter, the mediated image, the technical verification, the tactile human contact, the studied quiet, and finally social acknowledgement. It is a movement from surprise to stewardship, each step marked by distinct sounds and textures that anchor the work to bodies as much as to documents. We can map that rhythm onto our breathing. Inhale at the tug, hold at the photograph's reveal, exhale with the diver's hand pulling up the peg. Finally, place your hands in imagination on the cool stone of a ziggurat terrace. Feel the calcified salt's microscrape under the glove and let the memory of the child's peg, its small curve, remain as the warmth in your palm. Our modern instruments have brought us close. Our careful hands and measured imaginations keep us respectful. We carry onward, then, with a new tenderness, an awareness that discovery is not merely the accumulation of facts but the slow, delicate work of holding memory in and passing it forward with patient hands and quiet respect, so that the peg's small story remains lodged in the care of many. We gather now, as if rounding a low-roomed quay, to bring our descent to a gentle conclusion. The day's small music, the harbor's creak, the hearth's soft slap, the plane's breathing, has folded into one muted chord that vibrates just beneath the breastbone. Feel that chord there. Feel the quiet thrum as a companion pulse to your own. We bring our hands back, imaginatively, to the warm, calcified stone of the ziggurat terrace and to the peg that rested in the inner chamber. Those tactile images are an anchor as the sea eases its voice. In the softened ledger of memory we have been compiling, certain tactile motifs recur, like refrain, sand brushed into crevices, salt crusting in a hollow, a root curling around a foundation like an old, faithful hand. Each of these textures has a weight and a sound. Sand that settles with a fine, whispering rasp, salt that flakes and gives a faint metallic grain to the air, root that resists and then yields with a small, fibrous sigh. We can place our palms, in imagination, on each of these textures and feel them translate into breath and muscle memory. We will move, very gently, through a closing pattern that returns us to the body by way of those textures: sand, salt, root, breath. First, sand. Recall the scrape of fine grains against the sole of a foot, the soft give that accepts weight and then smooths over it, and the distinct hush that sand produces when it fills a hollow and quiet sound. Imagine your foot resting on that sand now. Feel the tiny adjustments of ankle and calf as the ground yields and holds. Breathe in as the foot sets down. Breathe out as it lifts and the sand rearranges itself, patient and indifferent to haste. Next, salt. Sense how salt draws at a threshold, how it gathers in the hairline of a stone and brightens the smallest groove. Imagine the metallic tang at the back of the throat when a wind from the sea passes, and let that sensation be precise, but not sharp. Salt tastes like memory. It is the preservative of cloth and of ledger paper and the stubborn incrustation on an old bronze bell. Hold that taste briefly on the tongue as if it were a thin tincture, and then let saliva carry it away. Third, root. Picture a root's slow, patient encirclement of a foundation, the way it negotiates stone with persistence rather than force. Imagine the small, dry twang it makes when you brush it with a hand, and feel in the palm a fine resistance, like the memory of someone who remembers an old kindness. The root teaches us how to persist, not by blunt power but by steady, incremental claiming. Place attention on that method and let it be a model for gentleness in repair. Lastly, breath. Notice your own inhalation as it moves through these images, each motif filling the chest with a distinct shade of sensation and each exhalation letting it settle into the bones. Breathe slowly now, in for 4 counts, hold for a quiet count, then out for 6. Allow the out-breath to be a soft erasure that leaves only calm. Let each exhale carry away a small element of tightness from the face, the shoulders, the small muscles around the eyes. In this way, the body becomes a vessel for the memory work we have been doing together. We speak lightly now of legacy and quiet acts of care. Consider those modest crafts we mentioned earlier, the potter's choice of clay, the way a net is mended to a precise knot, the recipe that adapts when sea smoke changes the flavor of a stew. These are small continuities and they owe neither to grandeur nor to spectacle. They are the scaffolding of a life. When the peg from the inner chamber is held to a lamp and a conservator's breath catches at a pigment, that catching is an act of recognition that bridges centuries. It is the sound of one hand greeting another across time. There is an ethical tempo here. Stewardship is patience performed. We might picture a group of neighbors sweeping sand onto an exposed mosaic, not to hide it, but to keep it safe until rain and sun will no longer harm the colors. We might imagine teachers reading aloud the story of a harbor so that the rhythm of its comings and goings enters a child's dreams. These are respectful gestures. They are small and often unmediated by headline. They remind us that preservation is not merely the work of institutions, but the quiet labor of everyday devotion. Now let us fold those stewardship images into a humane, practical question. What do we leave, and what do we carry when a place changes its shape? There is a tenderness in deciding which things to raise higher, which stories to tell aloud, and which songs to let sink with the tide as they were always meant to. Sometimes leaving an object in place is an act of respect because the context protects it better than evacuation could. Sometimes retrieval and care are the only ways to allow an object to tell its story under lights and under hands that understand. Each choice is moral, domestic, and slow. We will not claim to resolve the moral calculus here. Rather, we witness with tenderness the small acts that constitute care. Picture an elder teaching a child how to find saltwort for flavoring, the child's small, eager fingers learning to strip leaves. Picture a conservator labeling a tiny box and pausing to write a name in a careful script. Picture a community map being redrawn to include a new marsh and to show a place where people still gather. These are acts that reconfigure identity slowly, and they bind the living to places that have been altered without erasing the human shapes that made them. There is also a mode of consolation that we should allow ourselves. The idea that water, in certain moods, is less an eraser than a preserver. Silt can be a soft, inclusive blanket. Anoxic mud can keep wood and textile in a state of suspended presence. Stone can hold impressions like an archive. These are technicalities that, to the lay listener, translate as a gentle hope that what is lost in one register of being may persist in another, and that future hands, patient and careful, may uncover traces that allow us to piece together a life in fragments. Before we close, allow a moment to attend to the communal soundscape one last time. Here, in memory, the harbor's rope slackening, the hearth's soft rolling breath, the plain's distant curlew. Place these sounds into a single, thin chord and feel how it vibrates in your chest and settles there. This is the sound that will be our bookend, echoing the hush that began our descent. Recall, too, the distant shimmer of sunlight from the opening minutes, the pebble click that sounded like a small bell. Let them return now as guideposts rather than as summons. We carry this cord back gently toward the surface like a lit lantern. We do not haul it up with fury, but we lift it as one might lift a sleeping child, with patience and a low, steady breath. Now the guided return into the body, more ritual than instruction. Bring attention to the soles of the feet and imagine the compact lane or the cool, giving mud. Allow the knees to unclench a little, like an easing of pressure under a stone. Draw the breath in slowly, in for 4, hold, and out for 6, and let each out-breath be a soft diminishment, a letting go of the fine, making room for a calm that deepens. Place your hands over your heart for a long, slow count, and feel the mutual beat underneath, the shared cadence that we have been echoing in the harp of our sentences. Let the shoulders drop, let the jaw soften, and in that softening notice a small widening behind the eyes where sleep will begin to assemble itself. We arrive, then, at the final loop of phrases designed to diminish in energy and to become nearly a whisper. Repeat them in your imagination and allow them to thin with each reiteration. We are held. We are home. We are held. We are home. We are held. We are home. We leave you, now, cradled by the hush and by small things that remember hands, the peg, the stone, the stitch. May your breath lengthen, may your limbs loosen, and may the images we shaped together settle like a gentle tide into the quiet of your bedside.